Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Local 4 Live. I'm Nick Monticelli. A live look over in Texas where search and rescue teams are desperately looking to find more than 160 people still missing from all of that flooding in the central part of the state. We can show you some video here. These are before and after satellite photos of just how destructive that water was when the heavy rains flooded the Guadalupe River in Kerr County. More than 100 people have died in the floods. That includes nearly 30 kids, and people from all over are looking to help. Rescue workers in Mexico now joining other federal agencies and states to look for survivors, but that proves to be a very difficult and daunting task. On Wednesday, Texas Governor Greg Abbott surveyed the damage at Camp Mystic. That's the site where several young girls lost their lives in the floods. These photos show just how high the water got in their cabins, and now campers are sharing what they went through as it was happening.
People from different cabins started coming to our porch and yelling wake up and go to rec hall because there's a flood.
How would you describe that 4-hour window where you didn't know how Lucy was?
I mean, just the longest 4 hours of my life.
Well, the sheriff there says 5 campers and 1 counselor are still unaccounted for. Ashley Barrissey is here now to talk more about just how much rain came in a short amount of time and why the Guadalupe River kind of swelled the way it did, causing so much destruction in an area that there was really no place to go.
Right. I mean, we'll dive into the science here, but just, parent to parent, just hearing that parent speak, I mean, you can't even fathom what that 4-hour window was like and what the parents of the missing children are still going through. So, I mean, I just want to start by just saying my heart goes out to all the families that are affected down there. But yeah, let's quickly look at just the amount of rain that has fallen over the past 7 days, because we're kind of, almost at a week out now from when the onset of all of this was. And within the first few hours, I mean, that first day, we were looking at about 15 inches of rain total, now about 20 inches in hill country. And so that is just an astronomical amount of rain. But it's not just the amount of rain that fell. It was also the river swelling. There's only so much that a river can handle. And when you talk about hill country, a lot of that's drier. It has the slopes and it has nowhere else to go but to go down into those low-lying areas. And so that's what we saw happen with the Guadalupe River. And then it overflowed, creating the flash flooding, which we're not just talking about standing water, but with flash flooding. Now we're incorporating the speed of that water flowing in that area, leading to just, tragedy down into portions of Texas. So joining me is Justin Stapleton this morning, meteorologist from our sister station, KPRC in Houston. Thank you so much for taking time to join us. And from what I understand, Justin, you were on air covering this as it was happening. Can you just take us back to that time and exactly what you as a forecaster were going through?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Here's the thing, and you put this really well, Ashley, is that the Guadalupe River generally runs about between 1 to 2 feet, maybe 3 feet if you get a pretty good thunderstorm coming through. So people float it all the time. You can walk in it. It's fairly rocky, but it is very narrow. And those channels, when they pick up an enormous amount of water, it has nowhere to go except, out into the flood bank. And that's what we ran into. So I'll tell you, for us here in Houston, we were fairly dry. But interestingly enough, about 5:30, I started seeing flash flood warnings pop up on what we call our Storm Tracker 2 radar map. And clicking on one of those, I noticed it said flash flood emergency. And that really drew my attention. This was right at about 5:37, I want to believe, when I first saw the first one there. And now those started being issued about an hour before then, right? The first flash flood warning came out, I want to believe it was about 1:15 in the morning. So just a couple of hours after that, after they had been rained on for an enormous amount of not only rainfall in less than 6 hours, we're talking about some spots that picked up upwards of 7 to 10 inches in less than 4 hours. And it doesn't matter what river it is, it can't handle that. So when I saw that flash flood emergency, it immediately took me back to 2017, where here in Houston, when Hurricane Harvey was coming on shore and we were getting those feeder bands that were coming in, and we were starting to go under these flash floods. And those flash flood emergencies for us meant that it was starting to go into people's homes, structures were starting to fail, and this was starting to turn into a life-threatening issue. And that's what really drew my attention at that point. So I sort of pivoted from our local forecast, because again, it was 4th of July, right? And kind of shifted over towards, hey, this is what we're seeing, started alerting some of my producers, our MCCs here, our managers in control of content, and just saying, hey, listen, we may have a situation out here in the hill country that We need to draw our viewers to, but also given the fact that a lot of folks here in Houston either have ties or have gone out to the hill country, have gone to Camp Mystic. We've got people in our building here, Ashley, to be honest with you, that have been at Camp Mystic, are third generation members of going to these camps, and unfortunately the ones that saw some of the fatalities. So it was very real for a lot of folks here across the Houston area.
Well, you bring up Harvey. I mean, here in the Midwest, we were impacted by that same system. It tracked up towards the Midwest. It was so slow moving, and we had flooding concerns here. And when you get all that tropical moisture and it's, that system has to dump somewhere, can you talk more about the ingredients that went into this being such a significant rainfall, and also the fact that we talk about these 100-year floods that seem to be happening a little more frequently than every 100 years?
Yeah, and that's, as a meteorologist, you understand that too, that's kind of a misnomer. People think, oh, well, if it happened this year, then we're good for the next 100 years. And that's just not the case at all. So here's the thing I always like to tell people. If you're not familiar with the Gulf Coast here, and especially the state of Texas, where we live in Southeast Texas here, we live above the world's largest bathtub. The Gulf never cools down. So you have this ample supply of either tropical or near tropical moisture 24/7, 365, right? And so you had a bad combination of some of the leftovers of Hurricane Flossie out towards Cabo over in the Eastern Pacific that was getting wrapped around a big dome of high pressure that is in northern Mexico. So that was pulling into the state. And then we had gotten Tropical Depression Barry that had made landfall near Tampico in the central Mexican coastline on Sunday. So for 3 days, we had the leftovers of two different tropical systems that were both getting shoved into the state. Meanwhile, we had an area of low pressure just south of New Orleans that was also pinwheeling all of that moisture in. And the problem is that it got stuck. And that was where it was very similar to Harvey. If you remember, looking at some of the post analysis from Harvey, there were 3 areas of high pressure that basically created fences where Harvey got stuck and it just sat right on top of us. And that's how we got 52 inches of rain. So if you think about this too, and this is what we use down here in Houston, is that any tropical moisture, let's say that you're, and I'm sure you talk with your audience, what we call PWatts, right? Or what's the amount of juice in the atmosphere, right? And so the higher that number is, the more rain that it can make. So if we were seeing levels that were upwards of 2 to 3 inches, we will always sometimes double or triple those numbers, right? And so when we went back and we looked at some of the numbers that the National Weather Service in San Antonio were talking about, they were talking about rainfall rates, and that's per hour, of about 2 to 3 inches. Well, that's just with normal moisture. You add in tropical moistures or leftovers of a tropical depression, or even, the leftovers of a hurricane at this point, you can double and triple those numbers. Well, if you look out the 6 hours that it fell from basically midnight through about 5, 6 a.m., they got upwards of 10 to 12 to 14 inches of rain. That's triple what the initial 2 to 3 to 4 is. And that's what we always find to be the biggest trouble in terms of forecasting down here in the Gulf Coast, is that when you add that tropical moisture, you can take your numbers and it's a factor of 3 sometimes. And that's when the flash flooding can come on very quickly. And that's where, folks, you were used to flash flooding around here, especially this time of year. It's something that you get used to if you grew up around here. It's called Flash Flood Alley up that part of the Texas Hill Country, by the way. So those folks have seen multiple floods, just not to this degree. And I think that's where some of the issue was. What's interesting about this, and just in terms of for scale, the Guadalupe River generally runs around 2 feet on average. By Friday morning, once we had the initial wave of that come through, it had risen up to 19 feet and then close to 30 feet. And that all happened in less than 3 hours. And that's just really hard to account for sometimes.
That is incredible. We've talked a lot about the science, which you've given great insight into forecasting in your area of the country. Can you just give me more of a personal take of what that was like in that moment? Because as a meteorologist, I mean, we cover flooding here and there. We cover tornadic activity where you can see those warning tags from the National Weather Service, and you know that if you're in an emergency situation, that this is incredibly serious. So when you saw that tag come through, I mean, just as a human that's living in there, what were you feeling at that moment?
Well, I'll be honest with you, the first thing it did, I immediately shot back to when I was on the air during Harvey. I'll share a story with you. It was, I believe, Saturday night. So the storm had made landfall, Harvey, on Friday evening down towards Rockport. And by Saturday, we had multiple parts of our community that had already gone underwater. And I was receiving I can't even tell you, dozens of Facebook messages from people that were saying, I need help. I'm on my roof with my 2 children. We're at this part of Sugar Land, which is just south west of downtown Houston, a very, very populated area for us here. And there were messages from people that were like, we've had to break through the roof. We have nowhere to go. We can't find our car. We need help, please. No one's responding at 911. And, I can't tell you just how much of an absolutely crippling feeling that is. To know that there are thousands of people that depend on your forecast that I feel like I'm responsible for. And to just see folks that were terrified in that moment, I can only imagine what they felt like in the hill country, the great, meteorologists that work at the National Weather Service office in San Antonio, some of our broadcasting brothers and sisters that worked at our sister station in KSAT here, right, with DIV, and then, of course, at some of the Austin stations. I've talked to some of them and just checking in like, hey, how are you guys doing? And it takes a real toll. I want to go back to something I heard you say before you came on with me here, and you said as a parent yourself,
Yes.
you can't imagine that when that woman said that was the scariest 4 hours of my life. Sorry, it chokes me up. Like, I have 4 daughters, and I can't imagine how scary that would be if I couldn't find them. So, I think that's something that makes it very real sometimes, is that we take the science of our job and what we do very seriously, but I think when you add that human component in there and you see the effects of what some of these weather disasters can do, it really makes it real, especially, as I said, if you're a parent.
Absolutely, Justin. It's hard to separate your personal life from your professional life because our families live where we're forecasting. And like you mentioned, the folks in the newsroom that you work in have been to that camp. And so there is absolutely that personal component. And I appreciate you opening up, not just about the forecasting aspect, but also the personal side of that as well, from Harvey to what is going on right now in Hill Country. So thank you for giving us so much insight today. And I'm wishing all the folks in Texas the best, because I know that it's going to be a long recovery in the days, months, and really years ahead.
It certainly is. And, we appreciate everything that you guys do up there in Detroit during Harvey. You sent some of your folks down here to help us out. We'll never forget that. And certainly, any help that you guys were to ever need, we're just a phone call away. We'll bring the barbecue.
That's right. Well, thank you so much. One big family here in the Graham Media Group. So, yeah, thank you so much once again, Justin. Send our best to everybody down there, and hopefully you can get a little rest, because I know that does take a toll, Nick, on when you're forecasting like that. I mean, it's long periods of time that you're on air and you're trying to keep people safe.
I can't imagine. I mean, I was the reporter that was sent to Harvey to help KPRC and KSAT, and I remember multiple times being on the air crying, not only thinking about what the families were going through, but also the unbelievable amount of support that came from Texas and across the country too. I was standing in a line of, it had to be hundreds of law enforcement vehicles. Everybody just showed up to go rush out to figure out where they could go help and how they could do it.
Yeah.
And the challenging part, as you well know, is that Harvey parked itself
right
on top of that area, and it was relentless for days, and nobody knew what to do because there were no solutions. There was nowhere to go.
It's such a helpless feeling.
It was awful.
Yeah.